There's something about summer in the suburbs. The heavy heat curling off the sidewalks, the low murmur of sprinklers spinning across perfect lawns. My son Jalen and I had lived in Willow Creek for just a few months, and while most of our neighbors kept the polite smiles and quick waves, there was one woman who never seemed to miss an opportunity to glare. Mrs. Parker, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the kind of woman who thought a single brown leaf on a lawn was a personal attack. I told Jalen to stay out of her way. But 14-year-olds don't always move quietly. One afternoon, while I was still at work, Jalen decided to ride a skateboard around the block. No big deal, or so we thought. Apparently, Mrs. Parker saw him and called the cops over a skateboard, over a black boy in a hoodie and sneakers, rolling down a sunlit street. When I pulled into the driveway and saw the flashing lights, my heart dropped. But what happened next? The way she stumbled over her words when she realized who I was. That's the part you won't want to miss. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with a Karen neighbor too. Jalen stood frozen at the end of our driveway, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His skateboard tipped over on the grass. Two officers, one younger, one old enough to know better, flanked him like he was some kind of threat. I barely had time to put the car in park before I was out the door, my heels clicking hard against the pavement. "That's my son," I called, my voice steady even though my pulse hammered in my ears. Mrs. Parker was standing a few feet away, arms cross-tied over her floral blouse, her mouth twisted into a triumphant little smirk. He was loitering. She snapped before the officers could say a word. Skateboarding is against the HOA rules, and he looked suspicious. Suspicious. Her voice didn't tremble when she said it. But Jalen's shoulders hunched just a little lower. I forced a smile, the kind that barely masks the anger simmering just beneath your skin. "Is that right?" I said, pulling my badge from my purse, the same badge I'd worn for 16 years at the FBI. The shift in the officers' faces was instant, a stiffening of spines, a clearing of throats. Mrs. Parker's smirk faltered, her mouth opened, then closed, like she was suddenly searching for words that wouldn't come. The younger cop turned to me, cheeks red. "Ma'am, we receive a call about suspicious activity," he said, almost apologetic now. I raised an eyebrow. Suspicious, like riding a skateboard in your own neighborhood? The older officer shuffled awkwardly. Jalen just stood there, staring at the ground like he wished it would open up and swallow him whole. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. "Well," I said, my voice sharp as broken glass, "maybe you should take a better look at who's really causing trouble." Mrs. Parker's face flushed a deep, blotchy red, the kind of anger that bubbles up when someone realizes they've lost control of the story. She opened her mouth again, desperate to reclaim the authority she thought she had. I didn't know who you were," she stammered, her voice shrill now. "It's not personal. It's just rules are rules." I tilted my head, studying her the way I used to study suspects across an interrogation table. "You called the police because a teenager was skateboarding in his own neighborhood, and you said he looked suspicious." My voice was low, not yelling, not pleading, just undeniable. The neighbors had started to trickle out onto their porches, peeking from behind hedges and half-closed doors, pretending they weren't watching. Mrs. Parker's eyes darted around, realizing the audience had grown. One of the officers, the older one, cleared his throat and took a step back. "Ma'am, unless there's an active crime happening, there's no cause for action here," he said stiffly. It was the closest he'd come to admitting this entire situation was a mistake. Jalen clutched my hand tighter, his palm damp with sweat. I gave it a gentle squeeze. "You need to apologize to my son," I said, turning back to Mrs. Parker. "Right now." She balked, blinking rapidly. Well, I'm sorry if you misunderstood. Not me." I interrupted, my tone sharp enough to cut. "Him." The weight of the stairs around her finally broke through whatever shield she had left. She turned toward Jalen, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he straightened his back said everything. I let the silence stretch between us. Heavy, uncomfortable, exactly what she deserved. Mrs. Parker mumbled a few more hollow words before turning on her heel and practically sprinting back to her pristine white porch. Her screen door slammed shut behind her, rattling in its frame. The two officers gave each other a look, the kind of look that says we messed up, and quietly excused themselves without another word. I watched them go, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of my muscles. Jalen stood there, silent, until their cruisers disappeared around the corner. "I didn't even do anything," he whispered, his voice cracking just a little. I knelt down in front of him, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "I know, baby," I said, my throat tightening. "You didn't have to." He wiped his nose on the sleeve of his hoodie and gave me a small, broken smile. "She's still going to hate me, isn't she?" I hugged him close, letting the summer heat and his shaky breath wash over me. "She doesn't matter," I whispered into his hair. "Not one bit." But deep down, a bitter seed of anger had taken root. It wasn't just about Mrs. Parker. It was about a neighborhood that watched and stayed silent, about a system that made a mother's heart drop the second she saw flashing lights. I stood up, smoothing my blouse and looking around the rows of neat little houses, the perfect lawns, the American flags fluttering lazily in the breeze. No one else had come over to check on us. No one had asked if Jalen was okay. They just watched. I made a decision right then, standing barefoot on my front lawn, my badge still dangling from my hand. We weren't going to be invisible. Not anymore. Not here. The next morning, I woke up early, too early, with a storm brewing under my skin. I didn't just want an apology. I wanted change. After getting Jalen ready for the day, I threw on a blazer and drove straight to the HOA office, a bland little building tucked between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. Inside, the air was thick and stale, and the receptionist barely looked up when I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice bored. "Yes," I said, pulling out my credentials and laying them flat on the counter. "I need to file a formal complaint. Immediately." That got her attention. She blinked, glanced down at my badge, then back up at me with a nervous swallow. Of course, right away." I spent the next hour filling out every line of the incident report, detailing Mrs. Parker's behavior, the unwarranted police call, and the blatant racial profiling my son had endured. I attached photos, witness statements, a copy of my badge. I wasn't just another angry mother. I was a federal agent whose patience had run out. By the time I finished, the receptionist was practically wringing her hands. "The board will want to discuss this," she said, her voice small. I leaned in a little closer, letting my words hang heavy in the air. "Good. I'll be there." As I walked out of that office, the late morning sun hit my face, and for the first time in days, I smiled. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because I had flipped the script. Mrs. Parker had wanted to paint my son as a problem. She had no idea she'd picked a fight with the wrong mother and the wrong badge. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for that Thursday evening, held, ironically enough, at the community clubhouse where Mrs. Parker usually ran the show. I made sure Jalen was with trusted neighbor before I showed up, stepping into the low-slung brick building with my head high and my heart pounding. The room was already half full, neighbors packed into folding chairs, sipping weak coffee and murmuring under their breath. Mrs. Parker was easy to spot. Perched at the front table, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. She refused to meet my eye. Good. I wasn't here to exchange pleasantries. When the president of the board, a balding man who looked more nervous than authoritative, called the meeting to order, I stood up immediately. "I'd like to address an incident involving my son," I said, voice carrying clearly across the room. A few heads turned. A few eyes widened. But I didn't waver. I laid it all out. The police call, the baseless accusation, the humiliation Jalen had suffered at the hands of someone who didn't even know his name but felt entitled to judge the color of his skin. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I spoke the way I'd been trained to, measured, undeniable, leaving no room for misinterpretation. By the time I finished, you could hear a pin drop. Mrs. Parker shifted uncomfortably in her seat, tapping her manicured nails against the table. But what rattled her more wasn't me. It was a ripple of murmurs starting to spread through the crowd. People were whispering. People were frowning. The narrative she counted on, the quiet compliance, the unspoken support, was crumbling right there in front of her. I crossed my arms and waited. I knew the hardest part wasn't speaking the truth. It was watching who actually listened. After the meeting adjourned, a few neighbors quietly approached me, some offering murmured apologies, others just uncomfortable smiles. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall Mrs. Parker had built. I didn't waste any time. That weekend, I organized a neighborhood gathering at the park near the clubhouse, officially sponsored by the local community outreach office I work with through the Bureau. No HOA banners, no hidden agendas, just an open invite. Come meet your neighbors, hear real stories, build real community. The response stunned even me. Families showed up with coolers and lawn chairs. Kids chased each other through the grass, and little by little, conversations began to happen, real ones. Jalen even made a few new friends, his skateboard forgotten under a picnic table while he played a sweaty game of soccer barefoot. I stood back, letting it all unfold, feeling a cautious kind of hope settle in my chest. Toward the end of the afternoon, I gathered everyone around and told them the story again. Not just about Jalen, but about how easy it is to let fear shape our view of each other. How one call, one assumption can brand a child as dangerous when all they want is to ride their skateboard down a sunny street. My voice cracked once, just once, when I talked about the moment I saw those flashing lights outside our house. Jalen's head dipped, his hands stuffed in his pockets. But when I finished speaking, he looked up and he smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't loud, but it was proud, and that made everything worth it. Mrs. Parker never showed up to the event. She stayed hidden behind her lace curtains and clipped hedges. That was fine. Change didn't need her permission. It had already started. It didn't take long for the cracks in Mrs. Parker's power to widen. Word spread fast after the gathering. Faster than even I expected. People started questioning things they hadn't before. Why certain homes got cited more often for minor infractions. Why the HOA's rules always seemed to shift when it suited a few favored neighbors. It was like everyone had been walking around half asleep, and now their eyes were wide open. The final blow came 2 weeks later during the next HOA board meeting. The one Mrs. Parker had tried to delay but couldn't. A new agenda item had been added. A vote of no confidence in her leadership. I sat quietly in the second row, hands folded in my lap, while she sputtered and fumed at the head of the table. She called it an ambush. She accused people of being ungrateful for all her hard work, but the faces staring back at her were tired. Not angry, not cruel, just tired of the fear, the whispers, the power games. When the ballots were counted, it wasn't even close. Mrs. Parker was removed from her position with an overwhelming majority. She gathered her papers in a shaky, furious mess and stormed out of the room without a word. Nobody clapped. Nobody jeered. We just watched her go. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something deeper, a quiet, exhausted kind of relief. Jalen slipped his hand into mine under the folding table, squeezing it tight. I squeezed back. This wasn't just about one woman losing her crown. It was about something bigger, a community remembering what it was supposed to be. As we left the clubhouse that night, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The throne was empty, and no one seemed eager to fill it. The days that followed felt different, lighter somehow, like a pressure valve had been released across the whole neighborhood. People waved more, stopped to chat. Jalen got invited to shoot hoops with a group of kids he barely knew before. Even the way folks looked at us shifted, not with pity or guilt, but with something closer to respect. I could feel in the small things. The way Mrs. Ramirez from 2 houses down baked Jalen a tray of cookies just because, or how Mr. Lewis, who rarely said more than polite nod, offered to fix the squeaky hinge on our gate. Healing isn't loud. It's not grand. It's a slow, quiet thing, 100 tiny moments stitching themselves together into something whole again. One evening, as Jalen and I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low behind the rooftops, he leaned against me and let out a long, heavy sigh. "You think she hates us now?" he asked, his voice so soft I almost missed it. I thought about Mrs. Parker, still living 2 streets over, still peeking through her curtains like the world was a threat she couldn't name. "Maybe," I said finally, "but that's not our problem." He nodded, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "I'm glad you didn't just let it go," he said. His words hit harder than he knew, because the truth was, part of me had wanted to. Part of me had been tired, afraid, tempted to believe it would be easier to just keep our heads down and survive. But survival isn't enough for our kids. Not anymore. I kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of sun and sweat and hope. "Me too, baby." I whispered, "Me too." A few weeks later, the neighborhood threw a block party. A real one, not the stiff, committee-approved kind Mrs. Parker used to orchestrate with her endless lists and silent judgments. This one had bounce houses and music blaring from open car windows, barbecue smoke curling into the blue sky, and kids racing barefoot down the street without a care in the world. Jalen was right in the middle of it all, laughing, running, living. I stood by the grill, chatted with a few neighbors, when the new HOA president, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, came over. She shook my hand firmly and said, "Thanks for standing up when the rest of us didn't know how." I smiled, but part of me wanted to tell her it wasn't about being brave. It was about being a mother, about refusing to let my son believe, even for a second, that he didn't deserve to belong exactly where he stood. As the sun dipped low and the first stars began to prick the sky, Jalen tugged at my sleeve. "Come on, Mom," he said, his face lit up with pure, easy joy. "Let's race." I kicked off my sandals, laughed, and ran after him down the cracked sidewalk, past houses that no longer felt so heavy with judgment, past neighbors who had finally seen us as more than just a story whispered in fear. Mrs. Parker's house sat dark and silent as we passed it, curtains drawn, lights off, a house that had once ruled the street, now just another address. I didn't even glance at it. I was too busy chasing my son, barefoot and breathless under the wide, forgiving sky, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like we were exactly where we were meant to be,